I'm just looking. So the first page in your chapter 8 packet, 1 Chronicles 13, 5 through 7, I included in there. That's the one I was trying to find earlier. It actually goes with chapter 7, not chapter 8. And it says, so David gathered together all of Israel from Shihor in Egypt to as far as the entrance of Hamath to bring the ark of God from Kirjath Jearim. And David and all Israel went up to Baalat to Kirjath Jearim, which belonged to Judah, to bring up the ark of the Lord, which dwells between the cherubim. So they carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab. And Uzzah and Ahiah drove the cart. So this was the one that went with chapter 7, just showing you that when David comes and gets it, he takes it from the house of Abinadab. So if you want to move that over to the correct chapter. So it was there longer than 20 years, exactly, till the time of David. Alrighty, so came to pass when Samuel was old. So I thought, oh, I wonder how old he was. So I went back and did some research. Who can take a guess at how old he was?
80 or 90.
If you're right.
Huh?
Make it 100.
He was 65.
Oh, wow.
Oh, I know. I was very offended by this when I read that. He was 65 years old. So it says when he was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. 65, they said 65 to 70, but probably 65.
Well,
That would have been old then, I guess. You didn't have sunscreen and stuff, so you look pretty old.
so how old was
He
his
could
son?
get Medicare.
So his sons would have probably been, what would you assume, like 40, 30 to be priests, or to be in that judging. So anyway, they would have been older, certainly. So he was old, and he made his sons judges over Israel. Okay, 2 things he did wrong there. First of all, we learn about his sons.
He was old.
He lived to be old. First of all, we learn about his sons, which we're going to talk about, and they were wicked, very much like Eli's boys. They were wicked. Now, isn't that just so shocking? I mean, you know, Samuel, here he was. God spoke to him. He had all of that, and yet his sons were wicked.
You know what? He was always on the circuit.
You think he wasn't at home?
Well,
You think that's what it was?
Well, I wonder if it was.
Well, really,
You think?
about that.
Well, I kind of wondered, you know, did he do like Eli and just let him go?
I'm sure.
Just not paying, you know.
I'm sure that it did happen. I mean, everything we're talking about is supposition. We don't know why his sons were wicked. It just is always very shocking, isn't it, when you see someone who is working so intimately with God in this relationship, and you recognize that the sons...
Eli was his father figure that
Yes.
trained him on how to...
That's exactly right.
good
That's
point.
exactly
The
right.
sons probably were not disciplined.
That's
why-
well,
like
we
you
don't
guys.
we don't know that. I mean, it's all
You can't take
supposition.
too much blame. You can't take too much credit. Is what I
There you go.
Yeah.
That is awesome. That is really very truthful, because faith in God and like we learned in Eli, the sentence was, and they knew not the Lord. And the knowing of the Lord is a very personal thing. You don't get it from your parents. You don't get it from your grandparents. You don't get it from your best friend, and you don't get it from your husband or wife. Knowing the Lord is a change of your heart.
Which is why Samuel...
And you don't get it from your church. It's a change of heart. We call it being born again. In these people, it was a repentance and a complete change of their heart. And for whatever reason, Eli's boys didn't have it. Or men, they were grown men. And it appears that Samuel's sons also did not know the Lord in that same way. The second thing that Samuel does that doesn't seem to be right to me is that he appoints them judges.
Right.
We do not have any indications that God ever had anyone appoint judges down like a kingship where it would go to the next person in the family. God appointed judges. And so Samuel somehow thinks that he's getting older, he's trying to leave Israel in the right hands. He decides himself that his sons are the ones to leave that. So there's 2 mistakes there, that he appoints people who were not qualified, and that he actually appoints anybody is not right. So the name of his firstborn was Joel, and Joel just means Jehovah is God. And the name of his second was Abijah, which means Jehovah is my father. So they were certainly given righteous names, Jehovah is God and Jehovah is my Father, Samuel certainly gave them righteous names, and they were judges in Beersheba. So that would have been the southern part of Israel, Beersheba. Samuel stayed up in those other 3 cities, which is more northern. They sort of worked in different territories. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain. They took bribes, and they perverted justice. So they were morally corrupt, right? What does this tell you is that I think it tells you that God put these people in great authority, that were leaders of worship, that were leaders of offering, sacrifice, teaching of God's word. All of that were in great authority, and with that power and authority comes what? Pride. That puffed upness that comes from being put into positions of authority. And look how easy it is. You should be the very one who walks most humbly, and yet they become perverted and morally corrupt, which is that whole teaching of Jesus that's going to come later on down the line that says, you know, good heavens, wash the feet of those. Be a servant. Be the most humble. I mean, you know, it's so different from anything that it appears that much of the priesthood had difficulties with, because even in the times of Jesus, they're still behaving the same way. And so none of that changes. With this power and authority comes this great fall. And very few of them really escaped it. I mean, when you stop and think about it, there were a total of 43 kings in Israel, and out of those 43 kings, only 8 of them were godly men. These are people that are selected to be leaders over the nation, and the majority of them were wicked to the core. So it's really a discouraging statement on, well, it's that whole remnant teaching of how the bulk of people don't follow, and there's a small remnant that stay faithful to the Lord. So they didn't walk in the ways, and all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. So he's back in his hometown. When it talks about all of the elders, keep in mind that this would be elders from all 12 tribes. So they're all involved in this. This is all important to them. So the 12 tribes would send leaders to Samuel. He's the leader of all of these people in Ramah, and they said to him, look, look, Samuel, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all of the nations. He came to the right man. They knew that he was the representative of God to them at this time. They come to him, and they point out the same things that Eli heard, which we talked about. Eli knew that his sons were not walking in the right way and didn't do much about it. Samuel must have known, and if he didn't, he knows now. The 12 tribes come to him and say, your sons are not qualified to lead us through this. We want a king. This was their idea. We want a king because we want to be like all of the nations. Now, we know from Deuteronomy chapter 17, did I leave that one with you guys?
Yeah.
Yep, I did. We know from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, that God is going to give, I'm not going to read this, you're going to be able to look at this week. It's called the Principles Governing Kings. And God is telling them all of the different stipulations that are going to happen when a king comes to Israel and rules over them. The things that he wants set into motion. So that tells us way back in Deuteronomy that God planned a king for Israel. That doesn't go outside the borders of what God wanted for them. It's very clear that he wanted a principled, righteous, godly king in line to lead the nation of Israel at some point. Had they held fast to that, had their faith in God stayed fast in that, then they would have been far better off, but they didn't. Instead, they said, we think we want a king now, because obviously your sons can't do it, so we want a king now. We want to be like all of the other nations. Well, God had set aside Israel to be what? set apart, consecrated. They were to be, what's the term used in the New Testament? A peculiar people. Sanctified, yes, absolutely. All of those terms. Israel was not to look like anyone else. They were to do a great many things that were different. Their rules and regulations, their constitution, the way they treated their wives, the way that their food that they ate, the circumcision on the 8th day. There were many different things that made Israel look unique and different. And that was on purpose. God wanted people to look at Israel and say, hey, these guys are different than anyone else in the world. And later on, we're told that that's when the nations say, we want to be like them. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but in a future date, it would. So that setting apart was critically important to the plan. Not so different than us today. Tonight in our small groups, we're going to talk about moral ethics in today's world. What does it take to be a Christian? Morally, how do you look to the world? How does Christianity look to the world? It's that same sort of dilemma of how peculiar do you want to be? They didn't want to be that peculiar. It was okay to have certain things, but they wanted to look like everyone else. And so Samuel prayed to the Lord. Oh, wait a second. I missed verse 6. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. Why would it displease Samuel?
Well, his sons were just...
Okay.
He felt rejected.
He felt rejected. His sons were not going to be following in his footsteps. It was a rejection of himself and a rejection of the Lord, right? Mm-hmm. And so although Samuel sees it more of a rejection of himself, because we just talked about the fact that Samuel is the head guy, he's the one in authority, he's the one giving them direction. What would a king do? That very thing. Mm-hmm. So he's taking it as a personal rejection of himself. And we know that the last little scripture that I put on here was in Judges 8:23. It says, but Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. I put that in there because Gideon was a judge. He was previous to Samuel. He was earlier than Samuel. But he would not accept any type of kingship for himself or his son because he did recognize that God was to be the ruler over them. And so Samuel.
The Lord did tell Samuel, though, it's not a rejection of you.
Well, that's what we're going to get to now. But at this point, when he goes to the Lord, he sees it as a rejection of himself. And that's exactly what you're talking about, Carla, right here. And the Lord said to Samuel, heed the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So if you stop and think about that for a minute, the people are asking for an earthly king when they have God as their king. And he's saying, they don't want me. I'm not enough for them. Verse 8, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt. Once again, that event is brought back up again, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served other gods. So they are doing to you also. So this is nothing new. This is Israel. This is what they continually do. No matter, the Philistines have just been subdued, and the cities have just been returned, and the ark is just back, and things are better. But it's nothing new, because when things go well for Israel, that's when they turn to other gods. It's only when things go badly for Israel that they cry out and lament to the Lord. Verse 9, now therefore, or because of that, because of who they are, the type of people they are, heed their voice. However, you shall solemnly forewarn them and show them the behavior of the king who will reign over them. So later on down the road, they cannot claim ignorance. They cannot say, oh, we had no idea that these out of 43 kings, only 8 of them would be good. We had no idea of that, because here is where God tells them. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who asked him for a king. And he said, these are the words that he told the people. He's telling them all that this is what a king is going to do. This will be the behavior of the king who's going to rule over you. He's going to take your sons. He is going to appoint them to his own chariots and to be his horsemen. So he's going to take your sons and put them in the army. And some are going to run before his chariots. That's your sons. He will appoint captains over the thousands and captains over his 50s. Some will set to plow in his ground and reap his harvest, and some to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. Your sons he's going to take to do that. Your daughters, he's going to take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, bakers. Your fields, he's going to take the best of your fields, your vineyards, your olive groves. He'll give them to his own servants. Your servants, he's going to take a tenth of the grain of the vintage and give it to his officers and servants, and then he's going to take your male servants and your female servants and your finest young men and your donkeys, and he's going to put them to his own work. He's going to take a tenth of all your sheep, and you are going to end up being his servants. And you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, and the Lord will not hear you in that day. And we see that historically, that is exactly what happens. Israel over and over again is going to cry under the burden of wicked leadership, and God just allows it to continue on because they got what they asked for.
Can I have something?
Sure.
They talk about some making weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. It sounds like they have iron now.
Well, not at this point, but they will. It'll be coming down the road. And he's not talking about just Saul coming up that's going to be appointed. He's talking about the history of Israel. This is what it's going to be all the way down the line. And over and over and over again, if you read the history of Israel, you see they cried out under the burden of these horrible, horrible kings who brought death and destruction and slavery and judgment and all kinds of negative things against them with their evil behavior. But that's what they wanted. They wanted to pick the king that they wanted. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, we will have a king over us. So they heard everything that he said. It's going to take your sons, going to take your daughters, going to take your servants, going to take your fields, going to take your riches, going to take your flocks, going to take everything, and you are going to cry out under that. And I'm not going to listen when you do. And they said, okay, we'll take him. It just defies logic that they would do that. And nevertheless, the people, they said, no, but we will have a king over us. Verse 20, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battle. Well, that's, what they wanted. And so that is what they got. 21, and Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. He was, when you talk about that, you have to know that the Lord heard the people saying that, right? He's not in that little box. So he heard the people saying that. But Samuel is going to the Lord for guidance, and he's saying, Lord, here's what they're saying. They still want a king, even after everything that we've said. And the final verse, verse 22, so the Lord said to Samuel, heed their voice and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, every man go to his city. So Samuel is going to go into the preparation period of discovering who is going to be the next king that's going to be decided. And at this point, everyone needs to go to their own hometowns so that the decision can be made. And they're going to get exactly what they ask for. So we discussed the fact that God had already planned on a king for Israel. He wanted a good, godly king. The question comes into mind, you can't press the hand of God. I mean, for crying out loud, you can't beat him down. Why would he let the people have what they asked for and give them Saul? Because obviously the man who was after God's own heart and that he had prepared for kingship was David. Right? It was through the lineage of David. God had prepared for the Messiah to come through and all of that. Why would he allow Saul?
Natural consequences.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And there's also something that is known as directive will of God, which is what he has planned to happen and permissive will of God. God will permit things that are not his directive will. And through those very things, lessons are taught. Over and over again. And when we read the Old Testament specifically, boy, that is a powerful lesson that we see is you get what you ask for oftentimes, and it is painful. It hurts. But through it, God doesn't just leave them to languish in that pain and suffering. So many times they learn really important, critical lessons. And so with God, nothing is ever wasted, right?
And how best do we learn?
It's true for us today, isn't it? Absolutely.
Painful.
Absolutely true for us today.